Hello and welcome to another Me RIT webinar. This virtual event series was created exclusively for RIT alumni through the RIT for Life commitment to your continuing professional and personal education. I'm Cindy Sobroy, Executive Director of Marketing and Communications here at RIT and your moderator for today's webinar. Before we start, let's take a brief moment to ensure that everyone is ready and familiar with the presentation tools. All participants in today's webinar have joined in mute mode and cannot be heard. However, we encourage your participation. To submit your questions at any time, please enter them in the chat box. The chat box can be found by clicking on the chat icon located at the top right for PC users and bottom right for Mac users. If you are unable to locate the chat box, please follow the link provided on the slide on your screen for more information. We will make every effort to address all your comments and questions throughout the presentation. If you are viewing the webinar in full screen mode, please note that you will have to return to the traditional screen view to access the chat box. Note that today's webinar will be recorded and made available, complete with captions, within a week following today's event. All participants will receive an email with the link to that recording. Any technical questions come up, please type those into the chat box and we'll do our very best to get you the appropriate answers. And with that, let's get started. Today's webinar is titled Communicating in a Diverse World, and our presenter today is Dr. Keith Jenkins, Professor and Interim Vice President and Associate Provost for Diversity and Inclusion here at RIT. Since coming to RIT in 1992, Keith has served as RIT faculty in residence, RIT's first assistant provost for diversity, director of undergraduate degree programs in the School of Communication, and interim vice president and associate provost for the Division for Diversity and Inclusion. Keith is the recipient of many awards. Among the RIT awards are the 2010 Eisenhower Award for Outstanding Teaching, the 2005 Isaac L. Jordan Pluralism Award, the 2004 RIT Diversity Trailblazer Award, the 93-94 Provost Excellent in Teaching Award, the 96 and 97 Higher Education Opportunity Program Community Professor Awards, and the National Technical Institute for the Deaf's 1995 Pluralism Award. Keith's scholarly publications and presentations center around studies in intercultural communication, political and visual rhetoric, and the rhetoric of gospel song. Most recently, the focus of his research has been on pragmatism and the rhetoric of inclusion in Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign. We are very lucky to have Keith with us today, and thanks for joining, Keith. Please, let's take it away.
Good afternoon. I hope that you all are having a great day, and I want you to think about the words that I just shared with you as a way of welcoming you. I simply began by saying the words, good afternoon. Think about the greetings that you extend to others every day when you meet them, whether they be family members, individuals in your community, people you work with, individuals you may hang out at the gym with, or any social encounters. How do you greet them? I wonder how much your world would change if each time you met a person, you had to change from the previous greeting that you had officially given. For example, if I said, good afternoon, I couldn't use that again. If I said, hello, how are you, or what's up, those words could not be used again. Or consider whether you shake hands with a firm handshake, or you give dap or pound, or wave or kiss on the cheek. However you greet others, whether a bow or a hug, those greetings, if they could not be repeated, how difficult could your world become? Greetings are a big part of communicating in a diverse world. Believe it or not, people within 30 seconds or so determine whether or not they want to proceed in communicating with you or not based on the way you greet them or they encounter you. All it takes is about 30 seconds. What we perceive when we deal with others in our world is different. As an interculturalist, I believe that all communication encounters involve a perception of difference, even within one's own family. I want you to consider difference by listening to a poem by Rudyard Kipling entitled We and They. And he writes these words, "Father, mother, and me, sister and auntie say, all the people like us are we, and everyone else is they. And they live over the sea, while we live over the way. But would you believe it, they look upon we as only a sort of they? We eat pork and beef with cow-horn-handled knives. They who gobble their rights off a leaf are horrified out of their lives, while they who live up a tree feast on grubs and clay. Isn't it scandalous? Look upon we as a simply disgusting they? We eat kitchen-y food. We have doors that latch. They drink milk and blood under an open thatch. We have doctors to fee. They have wizards to pay. An impudent heathen they look upon we as a quite impossible they. But all good people agree, and all good people say, all nice people like us are we, everyone else is they. But if you cross over the sea instead of over the way, you may end by, think of it, looking on we as only a sort of they." We and They by Rudyard Kipling. What the poem demonstrates is that perception of difference that I alluded to. That even in a world where we may say, I don't see race, I don't see color, Kipling would probably argue we do see those things. It is more a matter of how do we respond to difference as we interface with individuals who are different than ourselves. So what I want to do in the next few minutes is take you on a journey to provide you with a few nuggets regarding communicating in a diverse world. I began with the poem We and They as I followed greetings, but I will focus on three areas impacting our lives. Then I will deal with some key concepts related to intercultural communication. And then I want to introduce to you a model of intercultural communication presented by Carly H. Dodd in his text, Communicating Across Cultures, and then finally leave you with some guidelines for intercultural ethics. I hope that the information that I share will allow you to consider how you communicate effectively in this diverse world. So let's look first of all at three areas impacting our lives. One of the areas that impacts our lives is growing domestic diversity in the United States. If you look at 2000 to 2010, just that decade alone, the non-Hispanic white portion of the total population decreased from 69% to 64%, while at the same time Asians grew to almost 5%, Latinos increased from 13% to 16%, and we saw the creation of what we identify today as minority-majority states. I want you to think about that. If you visit the state of California, Hawaii, New Mexico, Texas, all of these are states where one would argue that persons of color are in the majority in those states. No longer are individuals who are identified as Caucasian or who may identify as white considered the majority in those states. By 2023, it is suggested that minorities are projected to constitute the majority of all U.S. children under the age of 18. So we look at a world that is changing a great deal. African Americans are expected also to drop from 16% in 2011 to only about 15% in 2023. I think many of us recognize already the fastest growing group in the U.S., Latinos, are expected to grow from 24% in 2011 to 30% in representation in public schools by 2023. So the world is changing. When you consider where we are today, other areas of diversity include diversity as it pertains to age. For example, the 45 to 64 cohort increased between 2000 and 2010, while the younger than 45 age cohort decreased. So we're looking at an aging population that is also changing America. So as you consider the diversity that we are dealing with in terms of growing domestic diversity, think about how you deal in the United States of America. Also consider U.S. immigration. When you look at U.S. immigration, the world's population is increasing. Now, I was born in 1960. In the year that I was born, the world population was just over 3 billion individuals. Now, according to the United Nations, the 6 billion figure, you're talking doubling my particular group, the 6 billion figure was reached on October 12, 1999. And the world population reached 7 billion on October 31st, 2011. So what you're looking at is a world that is increasingly growing. Now, when you consider, that first question that I presented to you, poll number 1, it asks you to consider some of the domestic diversity and places that you have engaged with others. If you answered D, which meant that you seldom communicated with individuals who were different than yourselves or had encounters with individuals different than yourselves, the question that you will have is, how effective will I be in a world that is changing at the pace and the rate that it is changing? When you think of the world's population and immigration, think about the U.S., which is now the world's 3rd most populous country behind China and India. And a lot of this growth is being driven by immigration, not by births. We're facing major immigration challenges within the United States at this time. But when you think about immigration, think about how we perceive immigration. Do we consider immigration to be individuals who come to this country being more associated with crime, with taking U.S. jobs, negatively impacting property values? Many of you indicated item B. 50% of you answered that you believe that taking U.S. jobs was a major challenge with immigration. Well, another 50% of you said that none of those things were things that you think about when you think of immigration. I want you to consider this, if you will, that although the U.S. media associate immigrants with crime, with taking U.S. jobs and the like, actual statistics bear a totally different story. So a lot of the information that we receive is not accurate. So immigration is another area that impacts our lives. A third area impacting us today is technology. And when you think about the world that we live in, we are definitely hyper-connected thanks to the cloud, computing, robotics, wireless, 4G connections, smartphones, and so we are connected. It is possible for me today to be able to interface with individuals all over the world and to do that very quickly, whereas in the past, we did not always have that luxury. One of the problems, though, with technology is that we don't find it necessary to seek compromises as much anymore. So when you talk about individuals digging in, not being willing to compromise, taking your positions as either conservative or liberal, pro-life or one who values freedom of choice, anti-immigration versus immigration rights, reduced government spending versus government programs, however we dig in, we don't find a value necessarily in seeking compromises anymore. So as a result of that, that becomes another area impacting our lives. So as we go forward, I want you to consider some key concepts that come to us from researchers Semivore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy. And they give us key concepts to consider as we communicate in a diverse world. The first concept they introduce is that of culture. And they identify culture as a shared meaning system found among those who speak a particular language dialect during a specific historic period in a definable geographic region. So if you consider the United States of America, we know that we are different from Canadians, We know that we are different from Mexicans, even though all of us share the same North American continent. So when you think about culture, think about that shared meaning system that operates within the culture. A few things about culture is that it is human-made, it is subjective, and the thing that allows us to transmit our culture from one generation to another is language. And that language allows our culture to be maintained within a society. So that's the first term that you might consider. Another term is the term communication. Now, communication, according to Semaphore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy, is a dynamic process in which we attempt to share our internal states with other people through the use of symbols. Now, many of those symbols manifest in the form of words. If you are deaf, hard of hearing, it may manifest in the form of sign language. Even though American Sign Language is a language that is primarily used by many in the deaf and hard of hearing community, it is still considered verbal code as opposed to nonverbal in the way we communicate. But then you add to this in terms of some of the ways we communicate, the use of symbols in terms of all types of nonverbal communication, whether it be a clenched fist, a handshake, embracing another individual. So think about some of these things when you deal with culture. Another term of importance to you would be that of intercultural communication. The key thing that I would emphasize with intercultural communication is that you're interacting with people who are different enough to influence the communication event. So whereas some individuals may come up and politely bow as a form of greeting, whereas others may embrace or give a kiss on both cheeks, others may be more acclimated to giving pound or dap or giving a firm handshake. These differences in the way we communicate with another manifest in what we identify as an intercultural communication event. Now consider dominant culture. Who do you identify as being the dominant culture? Now, many of you indicated when you think about dominant culture, you would say that it is none of the above. And none of the above, thinking about the United States of America, educated Americans, it wouldn't be educated Americans. Now, 20% of you thought that it would be educated Americans. Another 20% of you felt that adult white males would constitute primarily dominant culture. And then the majority of you, 60%, said that you didn't believe it was either. Well, according to Semaphore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy, dominant culture is generally reserved for those who are in power. It is referred to often as the umbrella culture, mainstream culture, Americans, European Americans. But in the United States of America, it would actually be adult white males. Power is based on those who have the ability to control the major institutions within one society. In the United States, those major institutions may consist of government, educational, mass media, economic, military, religious, and the like. So if you think about the United States of America and who still controls, regardless of who is elected president, regardless of who might be in some of the institutions within our society and included therein, still the domination is by adult white males. So they would be identified as the dominant culture in the United States. Another term to consider is that term called co-cultures. Now, all of us are members of co-culture, and co-culture calls attention to the idea of dual membership. For example, if I consider my own life, I know that I'm a first-generation college student. I know that I am an African-American male. I know that I am married and the father of children. I know that I am also the youngest in my family. All of these identify various aspects of who I am and speak to my dual membership or membership in more than one culture. So this is something that you can consider when you think about co-cultures. We are all members of differing cultures. Now, why is all of this important? I want you to consider this model of intercultural communication, and it's given to us by Carly Dodd. And the model that is introduced identifies two people, persons A and person B, who have an encounter. And the model shows that whenever person A and person B meet, they each bring in three things to that encounter. Those three things include their culture, their personality, and their perception of the interpersonal relationship. And it is those three things where difference may first be noticed. Now, when they meet, difference is perceived. And it is that difference about how do I greet this person who is different than myself? Do I do anything that might appear offensive? Well, that uncertainty creates anxiety, but it also produces a motivation for us to employ strategies of communication accommodation where we adapt and we come up with effective ways to communicate across those differences. And thus we end up creating what is called a new culture that is created for psychological comfort, meaning that if my norm of greeting another individual is to embrace or to kiss on the cheek, but I recognize that the person I am interfacing with, person B, generally will give a firm handshake, I may then adapt my form of greeting to accommodate person B. And my failure to do that may result in my not being able to create that culture C where we all feel more comfortable communicating across cultural lines. So these are a few things that you can consider when you deal with this model. Now, I will leave the model and come back to it later, but I want to deal with some specifics of this model so that you can consider these things when you communicate with individuals of differing background. I mentioned that each person brings into that encounter his or her culture. I want you to consider a few things about culture. According to Semaphore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy, the deep structure of culture is that which are the institutions that endure, that we each bring to the table. The messages related to this deep structure of culture are deeply felt, and they supply much of our personality and our identity as we interface with others. If you think about the deep structure of culture, it consists of our families, it consists of the state or the community or the history of a nation, and it also consists of the religion or the worldview of a nation. Now, as you consider this deep structure, consider a few things about family, for example. Family is the most prominent social group that exists. Now, in the United States, when you consider families, in the U.S. in 2010, 49.7% of all families contained both male and female married couples. And we also saw an increase by 2010 in interracial and intercultural marriages. They increased in the United States from less than 2% in 1970 to more than 7% of America's 59 million marriages in the year 2010. But when you think about family, family teaches us a lot about marriage. It teaches us a lot about finances. It teaches us a lot about how to interface and deal with others. But it teaches us also about gender roles, and that begins even before a child is born. Generally in the U.S. and around the world, males are socialized to be successful, aggressive, sexual, and self-reliant, whereas females, on the other hand, are socialized to be nurturing, sensitive, interdependent, and concerned with appearance. However, if you begin to look at these binary classifications of male and female, those binary classifications are more common in the United States and Europe and more in the Middle East. You have Native American cultures and many Asian cultures that do not lock people into these binary classifications. So we look at a changing gender role that is existing in the world. For example, in Native American culture, many Native American Indian tribes historically held transgender individuals in high esteem, considering them to be blessed with the spirit of both man and woman. When you look at Thailand, for example, Thailand even went as far as to identify individuals who in our translation would be identified as lady boys. And they said even though they may have experienced some discrimination in that country, it in no way measured up to the discrimination that individuals have experienced here in the United States of America. So we look at this binary classification being looked at differently depending on the backgrounds that individuals come from. Yet still, when you look and you consider some of the classifications of male and female, it becomes very interesting. For example, in Japan, the fathers are served first. They get the first bath, and they receive the deep nods and deep bows from the rest of the family, meaning that the father is held in highest esteem over the woman in the household. So there are differences that we might look at when you consider family. A few other things to consider. State. Now, the state deals with history, and history is the witness that testifies to the passing of time. And primarily, when you think about history, think about family trees. Think about our lineage. Think about the things that we've learned about what it means to be a U.S. citizen. And I'm contrasting that with being a Mexican citizen. The reason I want to contrast these two countries, I want to show you a map. Now, if you look at this particular map of the world and the way it could have been, this is a map that was provided to us by Smirnoff Vodka. And when they provided this particular map, they wanted us to get a glimpse of the world if the outcome in the Mexican-American War had been different than the outcome that we have now enjoyed in the United States of America. Imagine gold-rich California, oil-rich Texas, diamond-rich Colorado. And when you look at the numerous states that were controlled by Mexico that are now under the control of the United States of America, what they were presenting to us is how different the world might have looked had the Mexican-American War gone a different way. Well, history is a part of our background. As you think about history, I want you to think about some of our background in the United States. U.S. history has had many instances of violence, and that's what I want you to keep in mind. Many instances of violence and wars. What we've looked at in U.S. history is forced immigration and enslavement of Africans, the taking of Native American lands by force, the War of Independence, the War of 1812, the Civil War, the Mexican-American War. And so when you think about some of that history, that is all a big part of our background. And so all of these are things that impact us. Which of the following are most remembered when you think of United States history? So I want you to think about some of that, and I may have gone through them pretty quickly before you had a chance to answer, but think about that which stands out most in your mind as you deal with our history. I want to move on to our next item here, and that is dealing with religion, which is another part of our background or the deep structure here. Now, worldview provides a model of the world, which guides us in the world. You know, it helps us to answer the questions such as the purpose of life. Is the world ruled by law, chance, or God? What is the right way to live? What are the origins of the universe and how did life begin? What happens when we die? What are the sources of knowledge? What is good and bad and right and wrong? When you consider all of these particular worldviews, a lot of them are tied to one's religious views or one's spirituality views. And so when you think about all of these things that are at the core of who we are, we bring all of that to the table when we interface with another individual as part of our cultural background. So keep a lot of these things in mind as you deal with others. Now, if we go back to a few of the things that stood out from the previous question about U.S. history, many of you said when you thought about, violence and wars and the most remembered when you think of United States history. The Revolutionary War and the Civil War were the two that stood out most. And even though they may get some discussion, the enslavement of African Americans as well as the impact on Native Americans in this country may not be in the forefront of our minds always. So something that you can think about. What I want to do is move on to personality now. When one considers personality, we also bring that to the table. And I'm breaking down here just a few thoughts regarding personality. And think about individualist versus collectivist cultures. And I want you to think in general, if you most believe, and give you a chance to answer this next question, in directness or truth-telling, emphasizing community, groupness, and harmony, or fighting hard to avoid hurting others, or changing jobs to advance your career, where do you most fall if you could choose only one of those? It may speak volumes about where you fall as an individualist or a collectivist in society. I want to share just a few highlights of individualist cultures versus collectivist cultures. And I'll begin with the collectivist cultures. And I'll share a proverb that I think speaks well to what it means to be a collectivist. No matter how stout, one beam cannot support a house. Think about that. No matter how stout, one beam cannot support a house. Why would that be important for the collectivist culture? Collectivist individuals emphasize community, groupness, harmony, maintaining faith. They also believe in indirect communication. They're very concerned about others' feelings, avoid hurting others, and saving face. And so when you think about a collectivist individual and contrast that individual with an individualist individual, individualists focus on characteristics concerning self and personal achievement. There is a concern for clarity, directness, truth-telling, and straight talk. And then they focus more on goals rather than individual goals rather than group goals. So if you answered, which most of you did, 37% of you answered that you believed a lot in directness and truth-telling, that would place you in the category of being an individualist. If you answered, which 56% of you did, and emphasizing community, groupness, and harmony, then that would place you more in the category of being a collectivist. And so you can see some of the differences that may exist. And it is those types of differences that may break a deal when you're trying to negotiate with someone else. If you think about the idea of changing jobs to advance your career, that's more associated with individualist cultures. Fighting hard to avoid hurting others, on the other hand, is more associated with those of collectivist cultures. So that is another area, our personalities, where differences may enter in. Consider masculine and feminine cultures also. When you think about masculine and feminine cultures, I'll present to you two people that you might want to consider. And consider, if you would, one, President Bill Clinton, and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton. When you consider these individuals, think about answering this question for yourself. I believe that if you attack the issue, you attack the person, versus I believe in separating the issue from the person, even at the expense of the relationship if necessary. Now, depending on how you answer this particular question, I want you to consider that Hillary Clinton was considered to be more an individual who represented more masculine culture, while Bill Clinton was considered to be an individual who represented more feminine culture. What are the differences between the two individuals? You know, when you think about Bill Clinton, he had personality characteristics that included nurturance, a strong interest in people and interdependence, but he also had this free expression of emotions, that he could, laugh with a robust laugh, but he could also tear up at any time. And this full expression or free expression of emotions, compassion, service, and benevolence, that's more associated with someone who would represent feminine culture. Masculine culture, on the other hand, is more representative of those characteristics that include assertiveness, dominance, achievement, and where money and things are considered important and excellence is valued. 100% of you said that you fit more with a feminine culture as opposed to masculine culture. Think about the individuals that we elect to office. Where do they mostly fall? If you think about it along these lines, difference once again could be considered. Then you deal with monochronics versus polychronics, and the only thing that I will say here is that your monochronics prefer doing one thing at a time, whereas your polychronics generally do a number of things simultaneously. And then your high context versus low context cultures. With your high context cultures, much of the information is drawn from our surroundings, and little information will be transferred explicitly. Whereas in low context cultures, information must be provided explicitly, usually in words. What are some of the things that I might argue regarding low context versus high context? The United States of America is primarily a low context culture. What that means is that if you take a new job, you're more inclined to be given explicit onboarding for that new job. And that onboarding process will allow you to come to understand what is expected of you in the workplace, what T's you have to cross, I's you have to dot as you perform your responsibilities in the workplace. But if I'm coming from a high context culture, it is really the context that dictates what is most appropriate. So many of your Asian cultures tend to be more high context cultures. Many Western cultures are considered to be more low context cultures. So these are a few things that you can think about. Now, I'll begin to wrap up with our perception of the interpersonal relationships. Interpersonal relationships, I'm going to do a broad sweep of this by simply saying, I said within 30 seconds you determine whether or not you want to continue in communication with another or not. I want you to think about this. When you enter into a relationship with another individual, communicator credibility refers to how we size that person up. We size them up based on their competence, their character. Co-orientation refers to them being similar to ourselves, their charisma, whether they connect with us, and then their dynamism. Dynamism refers to their boldness and effectiveness in their communication, whether it be verbal or nonverbal. So we size people up within those first 30 seconds or so. But what's interesting to me is that when you consider verbal versus nonverbal communication, verbal communication only accounts for 7% of the impact of emotional meaning in a message, according to Moravian, whereas nonverbal communication accounts for 93% of the impact of emotional meaning in a message. What does that mean? It simply means that we are impacted most by one's nonverbal, more so than we are by one's verbal communication. Now, a few things that I will point out regarding the nonverbal aspects as we're coming to a close. Think about what is appropriate in terms of greeting behavior. I mentioned the bow earlier. Many individuals took offense when President Obama, in interfacing with Japan's emperor, chose to bow, and he showed the highest form of respect in choosing to bow. Yet there were many Americans in the United States who said that an American president should never bow to another world leader. They perceived the bow as showing subservience to another world leader, whereas President Obama understood that to bow was to show one of the highest forms of respect. When you think about kinesic behavior, think about what a message sends and how that message may be perceived by others. When you think about oculesics deals with eye behavior. There are some cultures that are more direct eye cultures, whereas there are some who do not value eye contact as much. For example, Direct eye contact cultures include Middle Eastern, French, German, and dominant U.S. cultures, as well as deaf co-cultures, whereas your nominal eye contact cultures include Korean, Japanese, African, Native Americans, and East Indians. So if you're growing up here in the United States of America and you value direct eye contact, and I see that many of you, in terms of, talking about I am someone who values, direct eye contact, I want you to think about some of this as you move forward. If you're someone who, regarding your nonverbal communication, you believe most in direct eye contact, and that's important for listening and showing respect, 83% of you answered that in this way, you are more synonymous with those living in the United States of America, where we demand direct eye contact. Deaf culture demands direct eye contact. But consider the Navajo Indians as another example. The Navajo Indians consider personal eye contact as a harsh way of indicating disapproval. And they even teach a story to their children about a terrible monster called He Who Kills with Their Eyes. And the reason they teach this story is to teach them not to establish direct eye contact with others. So from a cultural standpoint, we may differ depending on the way we communicate with others. A few others that you might be interested in, haptics deals with touch. We come from primarily a touching culture if you're talking about those in the United States of America. But we're not as touchy-feely as some other cultures. For example, Saudi Arabian men are known to walk hand in hand. That is not something that you see amongst men in the United States of America for the most part. In Eastern Europe, Spain, Greece, Italy, Portugal, Israel, and many Arabs, they're known to hug and kiss when they meet family and friends. Latin culture is known to hug and to kiss when meeting differing individuals. So depending on how we value touch, it may vary from one culture to another. Germans, English, other white Anglo-Saxons are considered to be more infrequent touchers. And so when you think about those who value touch versus those who don't, we vary depending on the cultural backgrounds that we come from. Finally, when you look at proxemics, Proxemics deals with our space. And the only thing that I will say regarding space is that in the Middle East, Youssef and Briggs wrote about how Middle Easterners stand close enough to each other to share each other's breath. Sharing the breath is like sharing another spirit. It is a high form of respect. In the United States, we value our space. And so you think about those types of things when we deal with space. And then finally, chronemics deals with our use of time. The only thing that I will say here is that we have values in the United States of America where we say time is money. That becomes one of our proverbs. Time is heavily valued in the United States of America. But then you have some extremes when you look at co-cultures. For example, you hear acronyms such as CPT. It was a term used many years ago and still used today by some, called colored people's time. And it deals with this idea of being casually late or tardy for things that are more social. But you add to that DST, Deaf Standard Time, which carries that same connotation of being casually late or tardy for something. Latin people's time, that is another concept that some of our Porter, McDaniel, and Roy allude to. And it is not unusual in Latin cultures for business meetings to start as much as 45 minutes late. And those are business meetings because of a different way of dealing with time. So think about that when you deal with people and you say, well, why were they late for the meeting? Possibly their consciousness does not dictate that they were late, but that they simply dealt with time differently. I'll give you one last one. In Native American culture, many Native American cultures, language lacks words that even deal with concepts of time. So there is no concept of arriving on time or late or tardy. So these are a few things that you can consider when you interface with individuals of differing cultures. Now, a few closing thoughts with all of this that I want you to think about. As we adapt to each other, it's incumbent upon us to learn about the cultures, to learn about the languages of the cultures, to guard against our own ethnocentrism, and to stay connected with our own culture. And what we have to remember when we think about intercultural ethics is that communication produces a response, positive or negative. The manner in which I greet or fail to greet another may have consequences that are lasting for one's lifetime. So think about communication producing a response, positive or negative. What we should strive for is respect of others in all contexts and in all settings, and to seek commonalities among people and cultures, noting that even though there are differences, there are many commonalities that we share across cultures. And then also recognize and respect cultural differences and be self-responsible. What does that mean? Understand that there are some times when I may mess up. I may not get it right. And those times I need to be willing to look inwardly at myself and make the adjustments that I need to make in order to ultimately create that culture C that we alluded to so much earlier, where there is a culture where we have adapted for psychological comfort, but it is at that culture C that we're able to communicate more effectively with others of differing backgrounds. I'll leave with the end of the poem that I started with. But if you cross over the sea, instead of over the way, you may end by think of it, looking on we, as only a sort of they. We and They by Rudyard Kipling. I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thank you, Keith. A couple questions have come in, and if there are others, please submit them via the chat box. Actually, the first is a comment from Randall, and maybe you could comment further, Keith, but he writes, there's so much more to polychronic, am I saying that correctly?
Yeah.
Culture, that just doing more things at once. This is such a vital area to consider when working with people from polychronic cultures where relationship is so much more important than timelines.
Yes, and Randall, I do agree with you. In the interest of time, I did cut it much shorter than the time that we could have spent on that. But when you deal with polychronic individuals, we talked about dealing with multiple things or people simultaneously. But even when you consider business meetings, for example, many individuals in polychronic culture tend to think in a more, I would say, not a linear thinking fashion. And so if you're placed into a group, for example, with more monochronic time-oriented people who tend to do things in a linear thinking fashion, if I'm polychronic, I may end up becoming stressed in that type of group. And then when you talk about experiencing high degrees of information overload, because I'm processing a number of things simultaneously, that is one of the challenges that may sometimes come up for one who is identified as being polychronic. And polychronic individuals, depending upon the research that you look at, according to Carly Dodd, he would say that polychronic-oriented individuals may experience procrastination due to trying to process too much information at once. And, you know, not all researchers agree, but that is one thing that stands out. And then very visually oriented people tend to be those who are more polychronic in their ways of doing things. What I find interesting is, according to Semaphore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy, they argue that more college students in the United States of America now are tending to become more polychronic-oriented individuals. And a lot of that may have a lot to do with technological advances that we're impacted by in society. So a great deal more can be discussed, I agree, with polychronics.
Thank you. Joe is asking, do you think drawing hard lines to categorize individuals in society creates greater division and divisiveness?
And you know, that's been one of the criticisms always when you talk about dealing with difference. And what I would say Semaphore, Porter, McDaniel, and Roy identify are greater tendencies that individuals operate with. And what they recognize is that no person can be pigeonholed or said that they share all aspects of any cultural design that you look at. We may share the broad design of any cultural group, but not every single aspect of any cultural group. So I think what the researchers in teaching intercultural communication would often argue is that you cannot box people in and say all people are one way or all people share all of these characteristics. There will always be exceptions to the rule. So you cannot do it in a hardline fashion.
So along those same lines, what is your thoughts and take on the current political climate in the United States and how that is impacting communication across across cultures?
I think what you're looking at is what I talked about, one of those areas impacting cultures today in society, and that is technology. It is our technology that has also allowed us to not compromise as much as we at one time would, and it has allowed us to dig in and not be willing to reach across the aisle to make the changes that need to be made. When you think about that, we can also operate anonymously when you talk about the use of technology, whereas I can be as rigid and I can be as, I guess, mean-spirited or insensitive as I desire to be, as long as I operate under anonymity, believing that others will not find out that it is me. When you look at the political climate in America, I think that we simply are feeling the effects of the rigidness that really started in, and you can go back through some administrations, but I would argue at the beginning of President Obama's administration, the drawing of the line in the sand to say that we will not compromise, that we will seek to make him a one-term president, caused individuals to dig in. And what we're looking at now is further digging in across party lines that is really not furthering what we need to do in the United States society for American citizens. So that digging in, many would argue, is hurting, but many are also, on the other hand, applauding the digging in, saying that the Democrats now had their chance, now it is a time for Republicans to have their chance, or conservatives to have their chance. But it is causing rigidity in the U.S. and causing many things not to be accomplished.
Thank you. Earlier in your presentation, you talked about dominant culture, and that, but you also talked about certain populations will be, the minority populations now will become the majority populations. So how does that shift in perception of dominant culture? Does that occur at some point?
Now, that's a good question. I think you asked, how does it shift in perception? There are many individuals in American society who believed that once President Obama, an African-American, the first African-American to be elected President of the United States, once he was elected, they said, now we're all even. Everything is equal. Everybody has arrived. The problem with that is that even though President Obama was elected President of the United States, still individuals who looked like him, who shared his particular ideologies, these individuals were not the dominant individuals in those major institutions in American society. So even though there was a perception that we have now all arrived, America is equal, and blacks share the same advantages as whites in America, many would argue that the major institutions in terms of their control did not change, whether you were talking educational, financial, our sports and entertainment institutions, and the list goes on and on. So I think that it will take some time for, American society to change in terms of equality being achieved across the board. I want you to think about something. During my time here at RIT, and I've been here now about 25 years, it was the first time in American history that a Fortune 500 company passed the baton from a leader who is a woman to another leader who is a woman. The baton was passed from Anne Mulcahy to Ursula Burns, marking the first time in Xerox history that a baton would be passed from a woman leader in industry to another woman leader. So it says to us that we still have a long way to go.
Okay. Something to think about. Lily's question is, what is Dr. Jenkins' vision to bring our diverse groups together as one community?
I think I embrace more effective communication, and that really results in us being able to communicate effectively across diverse lines. Carly Dodd, came up with an acronym that I really enjoy, and it was WATN, and that was, we must demonstrate a willingness, that's what the W stands for, to communicate across differing lines. And so that means that I need to be willing to do social things with, I need to be willing to work with, I need to be willing to visit the homes of, and to even do all types of social and sporting events with people who are different from myself. But he adds to that the A, accessibility. It isn't enough to make yourselves accessible physically, but you must also be accessible mentally. So that A, then, after you have a willingness to communicate across those cultural lines, be willing to also be accessible both mentally and physically. Dodd believed that that would lead to the T, which is task appreciation. And the task appreciation meant that as you begin to communicate across those differing lines, it becomes a task at first to say, I'm going to go outside of the circle that I would normally operate in and connect with someone who is different, go to a show that I would not normally go to, attend a sporting event that I would not normally attend, or just hang out with or visit the home of an individual that I would not normally hang out with or visit the home of. It would be a task at first, but he believed that ultimately that would lead to the end, which is normalization, that it would become second nature for me to simply pick up the phone, call a person, and not even focus on the fact that they are different because we have now established true relationships. So I guess the vision for the future is that we need to communicate across difference. That means pick up the phone, interface with, and interact with those who are different than ourselves. That is the way we break down the differences and we break down the walls.
Fantastic, thank you. That's good vision and good advice for all of us. That is literally all the time we have, folks. Additional questions, though, can be emailed to ritalum@rit.edu or tweeted to @RIT_alumni with the hashtag #BeRITWebinars. Any questions we do get, we will direct them to Keith for some answers and get those back out to you. As a reminder, you will all receive an email from us with a link to today's recording. We thank Dr. Jenkins very much for being our speaker today. He gave us a lot to think about, and thank you to all of our listeners for joining today. Please keep an eye out for an email because guess what? There are 2 webinars next week, one on the 14th and one on the 15th. So look for those emails coming at you soon with a very special webinar at the end of the month with our incoming 10th president of the university. So again, thank you all for joining. Please exit this webinar by simply closing your WebEx window. And please do let us know what you thought about today's webinar by taking a very brief and optional survey, which will pop up when you exit. Thank you so much and have a great day.